Hello, and welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to talk a little bit about recording. We're going to come at it from two different angles, recording for performances and recording for the practice room. I think this is a really good thing for students to be aware of, even if they are not necessarily going to do a lot of recording. In part because I think it will help you set your expectations and for you to sort of be aware of the way things are done. So let's first talk about recordings for performance and how that happens. So, maybe we'll start with professional recordings. So, for example, I've done a number of professional recordings, and I think the most useful thing for students to know, I think particularly for their sense of well-being, is that 99.999999% of professional recordings are edited. Now, what does that mean? It means that the performer, and there are a couple different ways to do this, and I've done it a couple different ways in my own experience. The performer will do multiple takes of a piece, and the best parts from each of those takes will be combined to create the eventual recording. And people tend to think that this is sort of a modern practice. Oh, that old music was so much better single take. Andre Segovia did not do single takes. They edited his recordings. In fact, we know he lamented the fact that he couldn't play it perfectly enough to get in a single take. Editing has been going on. I'm sure somebody in the comment section will correct me on this, but at least since the 30s, probably earlier. Basically, what they did in the past was they physically cut the recording tape and lay them out to make the edits. Today we can do it digitally. So this is not a new thing. It's not this sort of modern weird thing that is younger players are weaker or can't do a single take. This is something that's been going on for a long time. And I think the way to think of it is that a professional recording is like a sort of idealized vision of what a performer is capable of. We've all, as performers, I've had those, couple times a year, or maybe once a year or twice a year, you'll have a performance where everything just comes together. You play a piece and it's just like, oh my gosh, I've never played it better than that. And you could almost think of the recording as trying to capture that moment, not necessarily the performer's average performance. So I think sometimes people can be quite shocked when they see somebody live versus hearing the recording. Oh, the recording is so perfect and clean, and then they hear them live and there's some mistakes. So that's, I think, important for everybody to understand. So if you're listening to recordings of, Paul Odette, Nigel North, Robert Bartow, Jacob Herring, any of those guys, the likelihood, I mean, I'm not going to call out names or anything like that, but those recordings, those album recordings, are edited. That's completely normal. As I said, I've done recordings like that. If you go over to my Bedlam Early Music channel, I think almost all the recordings on that are professional. So they're edited. They pull everything together. And again, it's standard practice. The reason that's important for the student of the lute to know is that it can set sort of a really unrealistic expectation, or a really difficult expectation for you to get, to be able to play that perfectly and that cleanly. It just really doesn't happen. As I said, even for a professional, if you play, 30 or 40 concerts, you might have one or two that you remember as being just amazing. And usually there's no explanation for it. My experience has been you never see it coming. You get up on stage and you think it's going to be a rough night, and you sit down and you suddenly start playing and you can't do any wrong. And then the next day that magic is gone. So I like to joke that as a professional, most of the time what you're trying to do is take your worst playing and bring that up so that at your worst you still sound good. There are lots of live recordings out there of people, people will have their iPhones and stuff like that. So you can get a sense of somebody's playing live through that. But if you're listening particularly to like a CD recording or an album that's been uploaded to YouTube, it's really helpful to know, hey, those are 99.9% of the time, those are multi-take recordings, meaning they took lots of different takes and they pulled out the bits and then recombined them. And the way it's usually done is you come in and you sit down. Now, there are two ways really that I've heard people do it, and I've done it both ways. You sit down and you play through the piece, and then you take a second and you play through the piece again, and then you take a second and you play through the piece again, and then the producer will say, "Hey, we've got a lot of good stuff here, or not. We're going to need measures 75, measures 108, and you go and you record those phrases as the producer calls them out, and then you go and you listen back to make sure you have everything to build the final recording. And then usually what you'll do is you'll listen to those recordings and you'll say, okay, I want to use recording number 1 from measure 1 to the downbeat of measure 13. And then switch to recording 3, and then switch to recording 2, and you can even go in and say, oh, you know what, third beat, the end of beat 3 in measure 45, I fudged that note. Can we pull that from that? They can do that. And we've been able to do that for a very long time, and that is done. And amazingly enough, it can be done with live performances as well. Not to say that all live recordings are edited. It is possible, though. So it's something to be aware of. If you're at home, what do you take away from this knowledge? Well, you take away from the knowledge that you can enjoy these recordings, but keep in mind that they are idealized. When I started this channel, my primary focus was for it to be educational. And so all of the recordings done on my channel are single take. And what that means is, it didn't mean that I sat down and I gave myself one shot to play and that's it, and then I just put it up. I don't know what you would call that. I think you'd call it absolutely, awesome, like incredible. There are a few people I've heard of doing that, and they do it, and yes, their recording has some errors, but they just live with it. They live on the edge. A single take recording just means that it's a single continuous take. It's not editing. It's not splicing anything in. So all of the recordings, I'm just making sure that I'm being accurate here. I don't think I have any professional recordings on this channel. Like I said, if you go to my Bedlam Early Music channel, you'll find those. But on this channel, they're all single take. And I'll talk a little bit about how I do the performance videos on this channel. Now that has changed over time. If you go back to the oldest videos, it's literally just I'm using the iPhone. And then at one point I got an external microphone, and then recently I got a second one. So it has changed over time, but I'll talk a little bit about the equipment and the ways that I have gone about it in case you like it. If you don't like it, then you can avoid the way I do it. One thing I will say is I hear from a lot of people, they'll say things like, oh, just record with an iPhone. That captures the real sound of the instrument. There's no studio magic in that or something like that. Well, the iPhone has an algorithm for pulling sound in. If you record something, it changes the sound of that thing. So whether you're using an iPhone, whether you're using an external microphone, and we'll talk a little bit about things like adding reverb or not. Is that okay? EQ, compression, and stuff like that you'll run into. But let me first tell you what I use, just so you know. I was gifted, I think it was for my birthday or Christmas, something like that. A producer, my duo partner's husband, who also happens to be Bedlam's producer, gifted me these little Audigo microphones, or they got me one of these. Now, I'll say I am not sponsored by any of the equipment I'm going to show you today. This is the actual stuff I use. It'd be really cool if I was sponsored. That would be awesome, but I'm not. This is a company that makes a little microphone. It's quite attractive. This is the one that I'm doing this recording on right now, and it's the same microphone I have used on all of my performance videos. I think the first one that I switched over from just the iPhone was the Marco dell'Aquila Ricercar. So if you're looking through my performance video list, I think up until the Marco dell'Aquila, I was just using the iPhone. So it's just this little microphone, goes on a stand. It's nice because it's actually two microphones. There's one that faces forward, and then there's one that's sort of curved on the inside, so you can get stereo. So it's actually multiple microphones within a single structure. And then it comes with an in-house studio. What does that mean? So if you use an external microphone with your iPhone or with your camera, what you'll generally do is most people will run that audio through a program on their computer like Audacity or something like that, where they adjust the EQ, which is essentially what frequencies are being emphasized in the recording, because different microphones will pick up either the high end more or the low end more, or depending on how you mix, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Mixing is just when you have multiple microphones, how much of one microphone is present in the sound versus the other. I've joked many times in this series that I'm not a technology guy, and I'm still not, but I'm learning. And I think, one of the advantages maybe to hearing this from me is that, like, if you like what I do, then, basically, if I can do it, you can do it. If you don't like what I can do, then learn it the right way. Go out there and take a class on recording or whatever. That's great. So I got a second one of these, so now I can mix. I think I've only used it maybe, I think, for one recording that I've released, which was the Baker Fantasy just recently. That one is two microphones. And when you're recording yourself, I think the first thing you want to do is do a lot of experimenting. And I guess that's kind of been a theme for this channel as a whole, whether you're learning a right hand technique or you're doing something like that. What I would say is pick a consistent space. As you guys have seen, I'm always kind of in the same spot. I've rearranged my living situation, so there's a few new things, but it's the same spot. What I have experimented with is the microphone distance, and I'll tell you what I do with the two microphones. So I've got one that's about 15, 16 inches away from the instrument. I think it's off camera right now, but it's right about here. And then when I'm doing a performance video, I put another one farther back in the room. And one of the things I do is I clear out as much furniture and as much stuff from the room before I do the performance videos, so that I'm getting as much natural reverb as possible. Now, there's an argument with recording, which is, of course, that if you have no reverb, it's always easier to add, versus having a lot of reverb, it's hard to get rid of a lot of reverb. And there are mixed ideas about what amount of reverb is okay in a recording. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't care. It's already the fact that you're recording in a space. If you want to add reverb, add reverb. I mean, if you're in Europe and you live next to a castle, you can walk over and do your recording in this wooden stone space and have this beautiful recording, no problem. If you're in America and you're in a carpeted apartment complex and none of the churches are open or whatever, well, you do it in the apartment and you add the reverb. I think, as I've said many times before, that the room is the amplifier for the lute. And it always breaks my heart when somebody hears the lute for the first time in this very dry, carpeted, awful space. I've had to do things where I went and played for like a university class or something like that, and it was like in a basement, and I was like, oh my gosh, nobody is going to like the sound of this lute. Versus I think the biggest space I've ever played in was a cathedral in Chicago, and it was unbelievable. It was the easiest playing I've ever done, because you would just pluck it out and it just filled the entire room, and the lute sounds absolutely magical. So what I would say is, to those individuals who maybe have are anti-reverb in recordings, and clearly there's like an amount that goes overboard. It's hard to say where the line is, or adding reverb to recordings. I would say that it's just the same as hearing the same player in a dry room versus a nice hall. I mean, I remember studying with Paul Odette, who is, arguably the best Renaissance lute player on the planet. And I would hear him play something in the office. And of course, it sounded great, but it was in this carpeted office with a bunch of like hanging stuff like that. And then I'd hear the same thing the next day in the one of the local churches or in a performance space, and it was a different piece. And I think we just have to accept the fact that when we are recording something, there's a little bit of fakeness to it, no matter what. There's no real authentic recording that's capturing, the authentic sound. If you want to hear the lute as it's really played, go hear it live. And even then, I would argue that if you're sitting in one place in a hall, you're going to have a different experience than if you sit over here, than if you sit over there. The auditory experience is what it is. Like it's going to be different depending on where you're at, and we just have to kind of live with that. So what I do try to do with my own recordings is I clear out as much stuff from the room so that as much of the reverb as possible is natural. And then the other thing that has been nice is having the multiple microphones. So one of the tricks that I do is I've got the close mic, and I put the other mic way back in the room. I've got a bathroom back there, and I open the door, and it kind of picks up some extra stuff. So that's really, really nice, because then I can add some more natural reverb by just emphasizing that microphone a little more in the mix. Now, the nice thing about the Audigo microphones is it's all done on your iPhone, and you can literally it's really made for idiots. It's absolutely wonderful, because most of the stuff you just play around and you listen, you play around and you listen. So you can mix without needing any kind of fancy computer equipment or anything like that. So that's sort of the limits of my experience for performances. Now I'll tell you some of the mastering things that I do. So EQ is really important when mastering. So EQ is just you're essentially, it's going to look different depending on what program you're using, if it's Audacity, if you're on Audigo. But basically EQ is going to emphasize different parts of the sound range. So like the high pitches versus the low pitches. So you can de-emphasize the brighter sounds versus the lower, darker sounds. And you could bring out different sort of recorded parts of the harmonic series and get the recording to sound nice. Now, the other elements, you can, if you add a little reverb, that's absolutely fine. Compression. So this is an interesting thing. What I've noticed when mastering recordings is that if you sit down, now what is mastering? Mastering is messing with the EQ. Mastering is adding some compression if you want some compression. Mastering is adding some reverb if you want some reverb. The end product is the mastered product. The mix is the balance between the microphones if you're using multiple microphones. And the cool thing is, actually, if you're using Audigo, because it's actually multiple microphones built into a single one, technically the mix is deciding how much of the stereo effect, how much of those side microphones to use, and you can reduce that or you can raise that. So you can mix technically with a single microphone from Audigo. That sounds a little bit like a commercial, but again, I'm not. I really like the fact that they're technology, they're idiot proof for people like me. So when you're mastering and you're messing around with the EQ and you're messing around compression and reverb, the best recommendation I can give you is don't listen to it in one way. So let's say you're sitting and you've got your headphones on, and I've got a decent, these aren't like recording level headphones, but I've got some Bose noise canceling headphones. And while I'm mastering and mixing, I'll have these on, and I'll be listening very, very, very carefully through these headphones. But then what we need to do is we need to listen to the mastering through a computer, through your iPhone, and then the other place that I'll go and listen is in the car. And what I've basically found is that if you master to the iPhone, it doesn't sound as good as it does on the headphones. And if you master to the headphones, it doesn't sound as good on the iPhone or in the car. So it's this balancing act. You have to find the right amount of reverb, compression. Literally, for an idiot like me, it brings the volume up. It stabilizes the volume so that everything is clear. So if you want something to be heard well on an iPhone, for example, having a higher compression level is helpful. If you want something to be richer and more detailed and to show off the dynamics that you are using in your playing, then you're going to want less compression. And in general, it's going to sound better on headphones, or it's going to sound better on like a nice stereo system. Um, and if you're an audiophile and you're listening to me talk about this and you're like, oh my gosh, Laudon is an idiot, he doesn't know anything about this, it's absolutely true. I have fumbled my way through figuring out some of this stuff just through experience. I've done a lot of recording from the performing side, and since COVID, done a lot more myself. And I think what I will say is that I've at least figured out how to kind of get it to work. So I can hopefully reach out to other people and say, hey, if you feel like an idiot with this, you can do this too. And I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to just be honest and forthright about what I use in my recording process at home. So you'll play around with the EQ, you'll play around with the reverb, you'll play around with the compression, you'll figure out what works for you. How do I go about my recordings? So my performance recordings. As I said, they're single take. I don't do any editing. So I do mix and I do master. So what that just means, again, is I've got multiple microphones. So I emphasize the mix. I emphasize one microphone over the other. I find the balance. And then I master. So I'll play around with the EQ, compression. If there needs to be some reverb, I'll add some reverb to it. And then I'll listen back. Now, in terms of like how do I go about recording? So what I'll do is, like I said, I'll clear the room. I'll get all the microphones set up. I've literally got tape on the ground so that I always know where to put the microphone. I always know where to put the camera. I've written down in a little notebook, I think I said it over there, that has, you know, all the details, the sensitivity on the microphones. I spent a lot of time experimenting with that, and I continue to. And then on a practical level, what I do is I sit down. The best time of day for me to record is usually in the mid to late morning. I'm in an apartment complex, surrounded by other human beings living and breathing and working. We had a couple of fires in the apartment complex. There are, you know, maintenance workers and builders around the corner. So I have to really think about noise. And it's a good time of day for me because the lawnmowers have gone through. They're all done. Generally, most people in the building are off at work. And what I'll do is I'll sit down and hopefully it's quiet. And I usually do 5 or 6 takes. So I'll sit down and I'll play 5 or 6 takes. I put a little space between each take. And then I hit the stop button and I pick the best one. And that's it. Occasionally what happens is I sit down to play and then suddenly construction starts in the background, or somebody's banging upstairs or downstairs or next door, and I have to do some more takes. I have found that across my recordings, I usually get the take that I'm going to use within the first 3. And it's almost always number 2 or number 3. And then every once in a while, because of noise or outside pressure or something like that, it'll be one of the later takes, because I just kind of need to get over the fact that I have to hope. The worst thing in the world when you're recording, especially in a space like this, is that you play a piece and you get to that last phrase and it's going really, really, really well. And you're sitting there and you're almost to that last chord, and you hear, Dave, toss me the rock. Oh, and you hear some noise coming out the back window, and you're going, oh my gosh, I've got to do it again. So there's a mental game. And sometimes when that happens, I just shut everything down and I go, okay, I'm doing this again tomorrow. So that's my recommendation, particularly if you are interested in doing single take recordings. Why do I like unedited recordings on a channel like this? I think it gives people a more realistic, as an instructor, I feel like it gives people a more realistic set of expectations for what they can get out of a piece. You know, I don't have any problem with somebody who does professional recordings on their channel. I may do professional recordings on this channel, and in the description I'll put that it was edited, and that's absolutely fine. Um, but I think for students out there, it's good to hear, what does this person sound like without removing all the little errors. And sometimes that means I put up a recording and a few weeks later I listen back, I go, oh man, I think I could have done that better or something. But you just live with it and you beat yourself up. I remember at one point talking to Paul Odette, and he had I think he was going and getting something done with his back. He was going to a chiropractor or something like that. And he went in for the appointment, and they put on one of his CDs. And he said to me, he goes, it was one of the most excruciating experiences I've ever had. I'm sitting there, I'm trying to relax while this person's working on my back, and I have to listen to myself play. And I thought, oh my gosh, if Paul Odette feels that way, then, we're all going to feel that way. Because, his recordings are incredible. He's an incredible player. So that's about the limit of my advice for professional or for doing performance recordings. I do think in general, all of those things can produce a nice recording that you can share with your family or your friends, or even put on YouTube. If you want more detailed information, I highly recommend seeking out somebody who does professional recordings, recording engineers and things like that, because they will give you the real details, not this amateur here who's just sort of learned to hack by from home. Now, the other part of recording I really can get into the details on, which is in the practice room. How do we use recording to improve as players? This has a very different goal than performance recording. I like to think of it as the difference between like surgical neon lights and warm candlelight. So when we're doing performance recordings, like where I'm talking about where I have a mic that's far away and one that's close, and I'm mixing and mastering, I'm doing all of these things to like soften the sound and make it more beautiful and capture it in this idealized way. When you're in the practice room and you're using a recording to improve your playing, we kind of want to do the opposite. I use a different recording device called, this is a Zoom H4. I've had this for years. Again, I'm not sponsored by Zoom or anything like that. This is just the microphone that I have. And this is great. It's got no distractions. You turn the thing on. And there are settings here. What I would recommend is that if you're learning a piece, ideally, you shouldn't perform the piece until you've gone through and at least recorded it in parts and listened back. I won't lie, I've gone and played pieces where I haven't done that because I haven't had time or I didn't do my due diligence. But ideally, you should record at least every phrase in a piece and listen to it back. So taking some sort of complete musical idea and listen back to it to make sure you're actually producing the results you think that you are. Now, the way I go about it is I'll take this recording device and I'll put it pretty close, a little bit closer than my close mic in the sort of performance recordings, maybe 6 or 7 inches away. I'll make sure that the recording volume isn't too high, but other than that, that is it. And what I will do is I will play a phrase or a spot. I don't record the whole piece until later. But while I'm learning the piece, I'll take a phrase or a spot that I think I've got worked out, that I've got the fingerings, I've spent some time with, I'm feeling pretty good about it. And I will take that and I will record it with it sitting just like right here. And then what I do is I hit stop. And I do think it's a good idea to maybe play the spot 2 or 3 times just to get the average, because recording is nerve-wracking and you might get nervous and do something stupid. And then I put the lute away, and then I grab headphones, I plug them in, and I sit down with the score and I listen back multiple times. And I'm sitting there with the score and I'm listening for anything that I don't like, or anything that's not coming across the way I want it to. And then what I do is I make note of those things. I grab the lute, I re-record the spot, and I see if I can fix that. And I'll just do this for each phrase in the piece. And after I've done all of the phrases, at some point I usually do a whole piece recording. The reason I don't start with like recording the whole piece is that it's just too much to take in and too much to fix. But after you've done the detailed work, I think it's nice to listen back to the whole piece and kind of get a sense, is the flow good? Is everything sounding the way that I'd like it to on a macro level? The goal here is not to record in a way that pleases your ears. You know, the idea here is to really put a bright light on your problems. So there are ways to make an H4 sound really nice. You can set this up, and you can, you know, put it a little farther in the room, and you can of course take a recording from an H4 and put it through Audacity or something else like that and add some reverb and do all the things we talked about before. But what I like to do instead is just have a consistent place where I put the microphone, and I do try to be very consistent about, okay, center this many inches away, play, and then I listen back and I make adjustments. That honestly is one of the fastest ways to improve on the lute. You know, I think it is harsh medicine, but if you can become a great critical listener and you listen back to your own playing and then you fix it, you're going to get better so much faster. It's hard. It's annoying. The reason I like the H4 is it doesn't require a lot of setup. I literally turn it on, I put it there, play, listen back, play, listen back, play, listen back, so I can kind of dive into it. I don't do it every day. I usually, once I've worked through a phrase and I like how it sounds and I've got it everywhere, I won't do it again, other than that recording of the whole piece. Because, you know, there is, you will drive yourself absolutely nuts at some point. And then of course you need to go out and you need to perform it. You need to see how everything is working in the wild. So those are the two ways that I approach recording. And of course, if you're a professional, you will be called upon to record in different ways. I've had to fly out and record in under unusual circumstances or in weird places, and you just adjust to those things and you deal with it. I think the absolute worst thing is when you are going to play a concert and the venue or the people who've hired you for a concert, they didn't mention it at all. You just show up and they're setting up microphones and you go, oh, what's going on here? And they say, oh yeah, we're going to record the concert tonight. You're like, excuse me? And they just record your live performance. In fact, this is a very common thing now, and it makes me very jealous of performers in previous decades where they could at least go out and, you know, not be afraid that we use concerts to craft the pieces, to see what works and what doesn't. It's like, you know, you do one night here and then the next night you make a few changes and that, and if every single one of those gets recorded, you may have a bum night that ends up on YouTube or somebody shares, and it does make me very jealous of the days when you could go play a concert and everybody just holds the concert in their hearts and in their minds, and not, you know, through this, you know, terrible microphone that's 2 inches away from your lute, and, you know, it's just the changing reality of it. So I think that I've had to adjust to the fact that basically every live performance I have to do is probably going to get recorded. If you have any comments, particularly if you have advice, if you're somebody who's like a recording person and you know a lot more about recording than me, which wouldn't be hard, feel free to drop some advice in the comment section. By no means am I an expert in this area. I am very much a lute player who has learned to survive to some degree in the digital sort of modern era. And I hope people find this episode helpful, if only it just tells them a little bit more about how I do this process. Episodes that are coming up, I'm going to do an episode on learning to play the lute when you don't have access to a lute or can't afford one yet. That's going to be a fun episode for those of you who are, you know, can't get a hold of a lute yet. I'm going to do an episode on rubato. which is something I've gone back and forth on whether I want to do an episode on rubato, because I know it's a controversial topic. But I am going to do an episode on rubato, and then I'm going to finish out the division series, and then we'll see where we go from there. So I hope you all are having a great time working on your lute pieces, and I'll look forward to next week. Happy luting and happy practicing. See you then. Bye bye.